The roster is officially down to 53, and the Chargers surprised many by doing exactly what we hoped they would, finding a way to keep Tony Jefferson and 7 wide receivers, but also making some surprise cuts like Donald Parham and Tre'Mon Morris-Brash.
You are Locked On Chargers, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Chargers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into the Locked On Chargers podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Wade, joined as always by my co-host, David Drogemeyer, and we've been covering the Chargers now for 9 seasons, but this is our 7th year as the host of the Locked On Chargers podcast, bringing you your team every day. Thank you to the everydayers out there for making us your first listen, especially on a big day like this, now that we know what this 2024 roster is actually going to look like. And to make sure that you never miss the show, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from. David, what do we got today?
Well, Daniel, a lot of people thought it was going to be Tony Jefferson or JT Woods, and it was going to be Simi, Fehoko, or it was going to be Brenden Rice. But guess what? It ended up being all of those guys making the 53-man roster, and a couple of surprise cuts like Donald Parham Jr., Tre'Mon Morris-Brash both did some great things, put their best foot forwards, but unfortunately was not able to make the cut. And with the roster now at 53, the work does not stop now because the waiver wire is now the next thing up, and we got to see who the Chargers want to bring in.
And if I think we know anything about Joe Ortiz in a very short time, it's that he's going to be active there. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. David, Tony Jefferson, the long shot of long shots on this team, entering, preseason week 3, having to have a huge game to even be considered, I think, to make this roster. Did exactly what he needed to do, and it was awesome seeing that pay off. And also the Chargers being able to find a way to not only keep Tony Jefferson, but look towards the future a little bit too by keeping JT Woods on the team. But starting with Tony Jefferson, man, as a dude who spent last year in the front office with the Ravens as an intern, to come back to football and make the initial 53-man roster is so hard to do. So hard to do, especially when you've already put a decade plus into the league. So cool to see that pay off. And also, on the flip side of that, making a position we were hugely scared about going into this offseason a little less, I'm a little less scared of it now. Like, I actually kind of feel good about the group of safeties the Chargers are taking into the season.
I agree. I think, obviously, you know what you have with Derwin James and Alohi Gilman, but man, is it nice to have somebody who has some tenure and experience in the league, and also an intimate knowledge of the defense that the Chargers are going to be patrolling and putting out there. So I think that's invaluable for Tony Jefferson, and for Tony to make this roster, he had to go absolutely insane in the 3rd preseason game because, he dealt with some injuries and also, having to overcome being out of the league and climbing up the depth chart. Well, he did some damage in the preseason, and this is not the first time. This is from MIPBJ on Twitter. He said, Tony Jefferson ended the preseason as the 2nd highest graded defender, minimum of 80 snaps in PFF history. The highest graded? It was 2013 Tony Jefferson. So when it comes to the preseason, Tony Jefferson balls out, and he absolutely needed to put together this Herculean effort in 2024 to make the team, and that's exactly what he provided.
And I think the other thing that he provided was showing not only that he still has gas left in the tank, which when he signed, you just had no way of knowing. They worked him out. They had to feel pretty good about him physically at that point, but until you see him actually out there, you're just not going to know. So not only do you see that he still has plenty of gas left in the tank, you also see that how, he can make an impact at every level of the field, right? You saw a bit of everything. You saw him pass rushing and getting a sack. You saw him playing the run and stacking up 14 tackles in that game, according to ESPN. And you also see him on the back end intercepting 2 passes. Like, you can't have a more grand gesture than the one that Tony Jefferson put forward in that final game, which is so cool to see that pay off, because as Derwin James said right when they tried him out, I hope he makes it, because it gives me a lot more flexibility. And what it also gives the Chargers is a ton of experience after 2 guys who have been starting together, since last year, a great duo, one of the top safety duos in the league. And now you have Tony Jefferson, right? And maybe AJ Finley still is safety 3. But if something were to happen, or if he's not producing as that third safety on the field that's getting snaps, you have a legitimate option there. And I don't think it's crazy at all to say that he could have an impact. And at the same time, 3 days from now, he could not be on the team because that's the nature of this time of year. So this is the initial 53-man roster, but the important thing here is, hey, things can change. The Chargers add somebody like we want them to do. Somebody's got to go. And Tony Jefferson was probably one of the last picks to make this roster, meaning he's one of the guys at the top of the list if they're trying to make room somewhere. But the other surprising thing, I guess, David, was it wasn't an either or. It wasn't Tony Jefferson or JT Woods. And yesterday when we said that, it felt kind of crazy to think that they were going to keep 11 defensive backs. But that's exactly how it happened. JT Woods makes the team as a defensive back, but really as a cornerback, which is, I think, where he always belonged.
I agree. I think I like and appreciate the fact that this coaching staff was able to identify somebody who had some skills in coverage, who had some ball skills, but was maybe not necessarily meant to play the safety position. I feel like them moving JT Woods to corner accentuates what JT Woods does well and limits or mitigates what he doesn't do well. You're taking a lot of the space away from JT Woods. And obviously with JT Woods, the biggest issue was his inability to tackle consistently. And when you putting a ton of space in front of somebody and asking them to come up and make, open field tackles, or else somebody can take it to the house, like that's a big, gigantic responsibility that JT Woods unfortunately never really was able to hit head on. So in this preseason, he actually played more snaps at corner when you combine corner and slot than he did at free safety. And yeah, a lot of that was in the third preseason game, but I think that was his audition to say, all right, JT Woods, let's see if you can actually really do this. Can you be that versatile defender where if I need to put you in the slot on a certain play or in a certain package, or if I need you outside, then I need to see that you can do it. Show me. Yeah. And I think he did that. I feel like he was better against the run. I feel like he was a much better tackler, and he was able to use his gifts in coverage. And I think that is ultimately what allowed him to make this roster.
Well, and it's so impressive that he was able to make the transition in the middle of the preseason, right? And in a couple weeks, look as good as he did. And I'm not saying he was an absolute world beater out there, but like considering that he was playing safety 2 weeks ago, like
it's crazy.
He looked really good. And this is the thing, when you're looking at it from a macro perspective, if Dean Leonard, Cam Hart, and JT Woods are now your outside corners going into 2025, it's another hope, another guy that could potentially be a guy, because you have Christian Fulton and Asante Samuel Jr. headed into unrestricted free agency in 2025. Now you have more kind of dart throws to see if one of these guys can develop, because you're probably not going to be able to pay both of those guys if both of them ball out, right? With both your outside starting corners right now. So big time for them to keep him there. Unfortunately, this is always a kind of surprise cut time of the year, and Tremon Morris-Brash was deserving. Didn't make it. Obviously, I had him on my final 53-man roster. I thought he was deserving of a spot, but David, that's kind of how it goes this time of the year.
It is, and that's what makes these decisions so difficult, when you're trying to figure out what's the right mix going to be. And for Tremon Morris-Brash, I mean, he did everything he could. I just felt like this was a situation to where the edge room was so good and so deep already that this is going to take such a superhuman effort to be able to change that. And although it bordered on that, it didn't quite get there for Tremon Morris-Brash. 4 tackles, 5 stops, 4 pressures, a sack, and of course that pick 6 in the last preseason game. My hope is that the Chargers find a way to be able to put him on the practice squad, because there's obviously some skills there that, if honed, can turn into something down the line.
Absolutely. And it's another position where, Joey Bosa probably isn't coming back at that number. He's going to get paid next year, right? Khalil Mack probably won't be on the team next year. Now you have another guy there, potentially. If you can keep him on the practice squad, he might be my number one guy I hope they get on the practice squad as far as the guys they've waived and trying to get them back. I think he played that well. According to PFF, had the 3rd highest edge rusher defensive grade out of anyone who played at least 30 snaps in this preseason. So he played very well. He's shown against the run and the pass, and could be a guy for you down the road, at least a rotational player. I don't think that's crazy at all. But what a lot of people thought was crazy is the fact that the Chargers could keep 7 wide receivers. We said to keep both. They kept both. So we're going to get into that, and also Donald Parham's time with the Chargers coming to the end, on more on today's Locked On Chargers podcast. First, though, I need to tell you guys about Game Time, because if you're getting any kind of tickets to any sports, theater, comedy events near you, you should only be using Game Time, because with killer last-minute deals and all-in prices, views from your seats, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And right now, they have a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting the tickets for your favorite live events even easier, because with Game Time Picks, it filters out all the fluff to show you only the incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. That's only a couple of the great things that Game Time has going on. I also love that you can see from your seat a panoramic view, so you know exactly what you're getting, and you can toggle the all-in pricing, so there's no surprises at checkout. You know exactly what you're going to pay. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. David, let's get into the other surprises, I guess, for some, but not for this show. We had it right. No, I mean, it's always such a crapshoot, especially when you have a new regime. So, hey, both of us going 51 out of 53, especially getting, Nick Neiman going on a short-term IR, Chris Rumpf going on IR, and opening up those two spots was awesome. And it's only because of, how we cover this team every single day. So it was great to see that. It was also great to see that the Chargers, just like the Ravens did in 2021, found a way with the Greg Roman offense to keep 7 young wide receivers on the roster, which is definitely news today, because a lot of people had it being one or the other situation between Brenden Rice and Simi Fehoko, and it really would have sucked, because it's like, okay, well, one is probably going to be more impactful right now, right? Or he's more pro-ready right now, having been in the pros, but the other one you took for your future, right? You took to hope to develop into something down the road. Yeah. And I don't think Brenden Rice showed anything in training camp or the preseason that would make you think otherwise. Like, he is a dude that's worth putting the time into and developing and seeing what he can turn into. So, David, the fact that the Chargers were able to construct this roster and be able to keep 7 wide receivers, considering what this specific wide receiver room looks like, is something I absolutely love.
I do as well. And I appreciate the fact that, Jim Harbaugh was saying, hey, we want the best players. And I feel like this was a position group that showed that 7 wide receivers was warranted. They had 7 guys that you can find roles for. You can see how they're going to contribute to your football team. And, you're looking at this from a macro perspective and a micro perspective, the here and now and the future, like you said. And I appreciate that. Just because they're not, ready to go right now, world beaters, does not mean that they don't have the potential to turn into that, because when you get to the NFL level, the progression doesn't stop. Okay. It does not stop. It gets accelerated, if anything. So I like the fact that they looked at it from both sides and they were able to make it work.
And I agree with that sentiment to an extent, right? If you're willing to put the work in, you can get a lot better at this level. Absolutely. Right? Look at Quentin Johnston and the leap he's even made from year 1 to year 2. I mean, it's very obvious. Whether that turns into a 1,000-yard season, we won't know yet. But, like, if Brenden Rice can make that similar type of leap going into year 2, right? Like, that's a very good player that you got in the 7th round. So I love that. I mean, I think it's also a room where you have a Darius Davis, who's a guy that, would have to have a very specific role offensively if you wanted to use him as a wide receiver, but is mostly a special teams guy, an all-pro punt returner. So he's included in those 7 wide receivers, but you didn't have to pick between these two guys. You get to keep both of them. I think with Brenden Rice, you're already getting a guy who's a good route runner, right? Made plays at all 3 levels of the field. When Justin Herbert was out there, was really flashing at training camp. And Simi Fehoko, you get a guy who's a very good special teams player and was one of the best preseason receivers in the entire NFL. I think Eric Smith said 2nd in preseason in receiving yards out of every wide receiver. So
that was good enough to make it. Mostly throwing him the football too.
Yeah, I mean, he might have had like 1 catch from Luis Perez, but yeah, I mean, it was basically all Easton Stick that he put those numbers up, and a charged offense that really struggled. But on the flip side of that, you get, the other draft pick, Cornelius Johnson, doesn't make the cut. It almost looked like both your 7th round picks weren't going to make the cut. And it was always going to be hard, because whether or not you thought it was Brenden Rice or Simi Fehoko, it kind of always had to be either Brenden Rice or Cornelius Johnson the way that we saw it. Brenden Rice outperformed Cornelius Johnson. I mean, Jalen Johnson and Cornelius Johnson might have been, a good battle, because I think Jalen Johnson was probably the more impressive of the two of them. So he doesn't make the cut. That's how it goes this time of year. Sometimes you're going to have to cut a 7th round pick, and then one makes it in Brenden Rice, who I think absolutely deserved to make it. But like we said, it always comes with the surprise cuts as well. This one, we saw it coming, right? Like, you didn't know what they would decide. You had both of them making the team, Stone Smart and Donald Parham, because the room looks like that. Will Dissly, Hayden Hurst, and now just Stone Smart. They only decided to keep 3. I had them keeping 3, but I had them keeping Donald Parham. So he misses the cut. Never was a true fit for what the new scheme is going to be, right? Offense, lack of blocking, that ability. I said it yesterday. It's hard for me to imagine they're going to keep 2 guys that struggle with the same thing and kind of bring a similar skill set as what they do well. But Donald Parham, David, a guy that we always wanted to break out, right? Like he had so much potential ever since he came out of the XFL. We were excited about what he could potentially do with a 6'8" tight end. And now that run has come to an end, at least for now. Maybe he's a practice squad guy. It feels like someone would pick him up, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, for Donald Parham, coming from the XFL, he should be very proud of what he was able to do and what he was able to accomplish, coming from a league that was basically created out of thin air just a couple of years ago, and for him to parlay that into an opportunity to make it to the NFL and then have success in the NFL. Like,
well, and he came from Stetson College. Like, he came from a tiny school, got brought in as an undrafted free agent, flamed out, then went to the XFL and found a way back into the league to spend 4 years with the Chargers. There's no way to look at that as a failure by any means.
Absolutely not. I mean, it just shows you the perseverance that he has and his resilience for him to, to be able to, really go down that winding road and make it to the highest level of football. And for Donald Parham, like, he was a true weapon. He really was when he was on the field. But that was the biggest problem with Donald Parham was his inability to stay healthy throughout his career, because he had a ton of potential. And yes, he was a red zone monster. I mean, 6'8", how could you not be? Like, he was a guy that was really dangerous in that avenue of the field. And that worked with the previous regime. But now, with the difference in identity, with what the Chargers want to do, they want to be physical. They want to run the ball. They want to impose their will. And unfortunately for Donald Parham Jr., his receiving exploits were not enough to cover up his inability to run block. And so that's what led to him not being on this 53-man roster.
Yeah, it definitely seems like that. They must have been, more impressed with the improvements that Stone Smart made than they were with the ones that Donald Parham made in an offseason where he got off to a late start. And we said it in May. Hey, maybe not something to be super concerned with right now, but like, man, if you can't get back on the field, it's going to be very hard for you to make this specific team, even as a guy who was the number 2 option last year, right? And I do think, Brian Rick brought up a great point on Twitter where he's like, hey, who are the true red zone weapons that you have now, right? Because I don't think if I asked many people this question, they would get the right answer. Like, who had the second most receiving touchdowns on the Chargers last year? It was Donald Parham. Right. Yeah. And I don't think you would think that, just based on what kind of the thought process was with him, or, kind of what people thought he was. I don't think you would think, hey, he's second most touchdowns with 4 last year. But you are going to miss him, because the thing is about Donald Parham in the red zone was like, if everything broke down, if everything was perfectly covered, you could just throw it to a spot for him that only he could get to. And we saw Justin Herbert do that a couple times with some lasers where he's just, I'm just going to laser it in right there.
Yeah.
They don't really have that guy now. So that will be something, that this team has to figure out, where it's just, hey, who are your go-to receivers when you need them? Yes, you're going to run the ball a lot, but when you need to go to someone in the red zone, who becomes that guy?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely something that I think they probably still have to figure out. I mean, because
maybe Brenden Rice fills that a little bit, right? Maybe that's another thing he brings to the table, because Quentin Johnston has the physicality, the physical tools to be that guy for sure. That's what I'm saying. He might be the guy. If what we saw in this offseason with his improvements in route running, his ability to create separation, and ultimately, his ability to catch the football with his hands, if he's able to go up and high point the ball like we saw in the second preseason game, then yes, that is a guy that can absolutely turn into a red zone weapon if he's able to show that consistency. Yeah, and let's not forget about Ladd McConkey, who, obviously I think on big downs, he's going to be someone that you're going to, try to look for. It gets a little different in the red zone when you're his size, right? Yeah. And you have those tight windows and you're, him having to be in there. But if you need a red zone blocker on your team, Ladd McConkey, sign him up, because there's a video going around from the one game he played in against the Rams, and he absolutely pancaked a defensive back. That is how you get the rest of your team to love you. absolute, like, in just like the ferociousness in which he did it. Like, he did it with a purpose. And I was like,
he's got
okay,
that
lad.
dog in him.
Okay, lad. Yeah, literally. I mean, he showed me a lot with that. And it makes sense why Jim Harbaugh called him out for his blocking in that game too, because he barely played. So I was kind of like, okay, I mean, I guess so.
What are you talking about?
I get it now.
That's what you're talking about.
That's something you put up on screen for the whole team. Hey, if this guy can do it at his size and he's putting people's asses in the dirt, you can do it. There's no excuses there. So we'll see who that guy ends up being. I think Will Dissly, Hayden Hurst are both good options in the red zone. You know, I think that you have, you know, Brenden Rice, maybe Josh Palmer becomes that guy. We'll see. But I do think it's a good question. And you're definitely missing the two biggest ones you had going into last year, which were Mike Williams and Donald Parham. I also don't think we're going to see a lot of fades or anything from this offense once you get down to the
Gus Edwards.
So yeah, you have a guy like Gus Edwards. But there's more to get into because we now know the initial 53-man, David. But what we don't know is who the Chargers are going to put waiver claims on. But we're going to tell you which position they absolutely should be putting a waiver claim in right now for. We're going to get into that and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. David, let's continue reacting to this Chargers 53-man roster, but now looking forward and into what is next for this team now that we know what the initial squad looks like. But before we get into that, I do want to make sure everyone is making their second listen after making us your first listen, as always, because, you know, you're everydayers. We love you. But you need to make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Football, because they are going to be the podcast that ensures you that you're not going to have to face a terrible punishment at the end of your fantasy football season with your friends. Don't be that guy that gets stuck somewhere and has to be put in a terrible situation dressing up as a sad clown and going to a game. And I can guarantee that won't happen if you subscribe and follow the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Make sure you guys go check them out on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast from. But let's get into, David, the biggest question now, which is now that you have the 53-man roster, how do you try to improve it? And if there's one thing that we've seen from Joe Ortiz, I mean, how many late additions just made this team, right? DJ Chark was signed after the draft. T.R. Tart signed after way late, into the preseason. Yeah. He got signed, right? He made the team. You have Tony Jefferson, who got a random tryout. He makes the team. We've seen Joe Ortiz do exactly what he said he would, which is turn the bottom of this roster and, you know, turn over every single stone trying to improve this team. So when you're looking at what the biggest position is that you would be targeting with this waiver wire, what would you go with?
Backup quarterback. Absolutely 1,000%.
Yeah.
Like, it's not even a question to me. You watched a quarterback throw for a completion percentage under 50% across 3 games in the preseason.
Yeah.
That's what Easton Stick was able to accomplish. And, you know, no disrespect to him. And I'm sure him and Justin Herbert are great friends, and I'm sure he's fantastic to help him get prepared and ready for a game. But none of that matters when you have to actually step on the field and keep your team in a football game. And right now, there's no way anybody can have any kind of confidence that Easton Stick is able to do that, because he can't do it against replacement talent, which is what we saw mostly in the preseason. So the Chargers have to explore every way to get better. There's plenty of people out there. There's obviously some familiar faces like a Tyler Huntley. You know, if the Chargers want to try to make a trade to try to bring him in, maybe that's an opportunity. Obviously, there's several backup quarterbacks that got waived. This has to be a position they upgrade, and it has to happen immediately.
Well, the nice thing is it's probably a 1-for-1 swap, right?
Yeah.
You release Easton Stick and you bring in whoever this next guy is. And maybe if you want to keep Easton Stick as an emergency third quarterback, sure, he could be that, absolutely. But as far as the primary backup for this team, Easton Stick's just not going to cut it. And I think that there are already a couple guys out there, like you said, that would be instant, you know, upgrades. CJ Beathard's out there to start games in this league. Brett Rippon had a really, really impressive preseason. But it also feels like there's some teams that are potentially harboring, you know, third and fourth string quarterbacks to potentially get a team like the Chargers. Because the thing is everyone thinks, you know, the Chargers have it the worst. And they do, because Easton Stick was, you know, very arguably the worst, backup quarterback that was playing in the preseason. Lowest passer rating, lowest completion percentage, the list goes on. But there are other teams that have needs at that position. You just saw the Packers trade for Malik Willis. And now you have the Browns, who are keeping 4 quarterbacks, including Tyler Huntley, on their initial 53-man roster. Why would you do that? Like, there's no point in having 4 quarterbacks.
They're looking to make a deal. That's obvious.
And you also have the Atlanta Falcons, right, who drafted, surprising everyone, a quarterback in the top 10 in Michael Penix, behind Kirk Cousins, who was their big deal in free agency.
Yeah, which is weird.
So why keep Taylor Heineke, right? So there's definitely potentially some things already going down right now. Maybe it's not addressed on the waiver wire. Maybe it's addressed, through a trade, but the Chargers do have the they're fifth in waiver order. So they should have, a very good chance to get somebody that they want if they want to put a waiver claim in. So, besides that, we talked about, tight end is another position. They could try to upgrade on Stone Smart. Backup center is another position where it's like, hey, if there's a young guy that gets released there that you think has some promise, maybe you bring him in. But it starts with the backup quarterback position. I don't think it's particularly close here as far as what should be addressed first. But I also don't think it's the most concerning position on the roster because you also have Justin Herbert in that room. So that position isn't the most concerning to me. Now that we see what these position groups look like, David, what position are you most concerned about going into the year?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the most concerning position group, just as far as depth and quality to me, is probably the tight end position. I feel like I felt better about what they did on the defensive line when they were able to add Tier Tart. I do feel like that's a guy who's going to contribute. He's going to make some kind of a difference. But they are definitely going to be looking at trying to add another tight end, another blocking tight end that they can put in that room to add to, join Will Dissly and join Hayden Hurst.
And maybe that's on the practice squad too.
And right? Maybe that is on the practice squad for sure. But I feel like that's a position group where they should be looking to upgrade.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of the same thing we were talking about with the running backs on yesterday's show, where it's like you're not going to get a lot of games where you're using all four tight ends on offense. You can be using them on special teams and stuff, but you're not going to be using four tight ends in most games offensively. It's just not kind of how the world works. But I agree that, after the top two guys there, Stone Smart's still a pretty unproven commodity. I think they just feel really good about their top two guys at that position, and I think those guys can bring you enough. But it is a concerning position for sure, because you're hoping for health in the case of Hayden Hurst, right? You're hoping Will Dissly can continue being that dominant run blocker that he's been. I'd probably still go with the defensive line just because I think that Hayden Hurst and Will Dissly in a lot of ways are still kind of more qualified, or, at least put better production together at the NFL level than the guys we're seeing in this defensive line room. I like Tier Tart a lot. I like the room a lot more with Tier Tart. I can still look at that position group and say, you don't have a top flight player there. And you can say the same thing about the tight end, right? I mean, Hayden Hurst has been a top 15 receiving option at tight end before. Obviously, Will Dissly is an elite run blocker. So he's up there depending on what you're looking for. He's an elite tight end in that sense. On the defensive line, who do you have that's elite at what? Like, Morgan Fox is an above average pass rusher, but he's not really a full-time defensive tackle. He's just not. He's not a full-time interior defensive player. I think a big thing here is just the Chargers' kind of lack of addressing it, right? They haven't used anything outside of a day 3 pick since they took Jerry Tillery and whiffed on him in 2019. So that's not this regime's fault. No. But I think that's how we get to this part, right? Where you don't really have anyone in that room you feel great about. Defensive tackles are making a ton of money these days. And I think it's because you, for so long, tried to put Band-Aids on it with Brandon Meebanes and Limbaugh Josephs and Sebastian Joseph Days and didn't actually get the young guys and spend the quality picks that you need to, right? I mean, it's all been 4th, 5th, 6th round picks that you spend on defensive tackles since 2019. That's not how you build a good room. And this team is, suffering from what Tom Telesco and company put together. So the room is 6 guys in the defensive line. Tier Tart, obviously being one of them, he makes the team, which is awesome. But I thought he looked good. Scott Matlock, Tito Abonia, Morgan Fox, Poona Ford, and then the rookie Justin Aboigbe. But David, when looking at the most underrated position on this team quickly here as we wrap things up, what do you think the most underrated position on this team is? Because I know that a lot of people are hating on a lot of positions on this roster.
Yeah, honestly, I think for me, the most underrated position is the linebacker position. I love what they have in that room. I feel like it's a really good mix of veterans with Denzel Perriman and Troy Dye and some youth and just pure athleticism with Deion Henley and Junior Colson. Like, those guys are going to be a part of this room for a very, very long time. I think this linebacker room is going to show up and show out.
And I think considering, between Deion Henley and Junior Colson that you have like 60 defensive snaps between the two of them at the NFL level, it will surprise a lot of people. And we're expecting a lot from them, but they have to go out and do it. And they're still unproven at this point. I would say, for me, the most underrated group on this team that keeps getting overlooked is the running back room. Like, I think this Chargers running back room is super underrated. Both J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, to me, are legitimate starting running backs. I'm not going to say top 10 running backs or anything along those lines. I don't think you feel bad about either one of those guys starting if you know they're healthy. Like, Gus is a proven goal line back that's got 13 touchdowns. And is that a byproduct of the system and with the Ravens? Sure, partially. But I'll tell you this, Alexander Madison on the Vikings last year had 9 carries inside the 5. And he totaled on those 9 carries, -7 yards and 0 touchdowns. There is an art to it. You can be good at it. Austin Eckler was a good goal line back, right? Even as a smaller guy. There is an art to it, and Gus Edwards can do that. He's also one of the most physical backs in the game, and I think, J.K. Dobbins obviously comes with a huge injury risk, but if he's healthy, he's a very good running back, top 15 running back in the league, at least when he's been out there. He averages almost 6 yards per carry.
And he says he's healthy. He tells everybody who will listen.
And the thing is, we've seen it, right? Like, unlike the linebackers, which we're hoping for and projecting to be really good, like, these dudes have been together and been great. I mean,
That's
when J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards both played 15-plus games a few years ago, they combined for 1,528 rushing yards and 15 touchdowns. The problem is, it only happened once in, like, the 4 years those guys were together. So I think there's big questions about it, but we're not even talking about Kamani Vidal and then Jarrett Patterson obviously making this team. We missed on Jarrett Patterson, but we all knew if there was going to be 4 running backs,
it was going to be him.
Jarrett Patterson was going to be that guy. So really liked what the Chargers did with this 53-man roster. You can't keep everyone. I understand the Donald Parham part of it, even if I might have kept him over a Stone Smart. Tremont Morris Brash, it's just really hard to make it as an undrafted free agent. He did everything he possibly could to do it. I know they're going to try to keep him around. I'm not super worried about him getting picked up at waivers because the thing is, all these other teams have to create a spot for it too. So they're having to get rid of somebody they wanted on their initial 53. So I'm hoping he makes it back. I'm hopeful for that. Best of luck to guys like Isaiah Spiller, who the Chargers are moving on from, right? Best of luck to Elijah Dotson and guys like that. Matt Hankins, another impressive guy that didn't end up making it. But that's going to wrap things up for today's show. Tomorrow, we'll know a lot more about this team. We'll know some practice squad guys. We'll also know potentially who the Chargers claimed on the waiver wire. And the only place to go to find those details is the team that covers your team every day. So thank you to the everydayers, and to make sure you never miss the show, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel, as well as finding us on all of our social media. You can find the show every day at Locked On LAC on Twitter, at Locked On Chargers on Instagram, and our Locked On Chargers Facebook page. You guys can also call in for the next fan mail show at 323-524-7924, or get in on the buy or sell action as well. And as always, you can follow me at Dan Talk Sports and David at Dro Talk SD on Twitter too. So thank you guys so much for being here for this roster reaction. Make sure to be back with us tomorrow as we find out the practice squad and also potential waiver claims. But until then, guys, take it easy and go Bolts.